Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a case that, well, it continues to fascinate and trouble many people. The August 2019 death of Jeffrey Epstein.
Right. While he was in federal custody, awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges.
Exactly. It seems straightforward on the surface, but it's become anything but simple.
And the core of this deep dive, really, is that official finding. Suicide by hanging. But the circumstances surrounding his death just fueled so many persistent questions.
Was it really suicide? Or were there other factors involved?
And public skepticism, I mean, as our sources show, it remains incredibly strong. You see it everywhere.
Absolutely. So, to really try and get a handle on this, we've pulled together a range of sources. We'll be looking at bits from a legal complaint, basically, a formal court document.
Filed by Jane Doe's against the U.S. government.
Yeah, alleging FBI failures in the whole Epstein case. We've also got the Wikipedia pages on the death of Jeffrey Epstein and that meme.
Oh, the Epstein didn't kill himself meme, which
Mm.
became surprisingly pervasive.
It really did. Then we'll look at a transcript from a pretty revealing 60 Minutes report that really dove into Epstein's autopsy.
And finally, a PBS NewsHour piece where the medical examiner directly addressed and, well, dismissed the doubts about her findings.
So our aim here is to kind of synthesize these different accounts
Trace the events, look at the controversies, scrutinize the medical evidence.
and ultimately help you, our listener, understand the main points of disagreement that still swirl around this whole thing.
Okay, so let's unpack this. It really kicks off in 2019, July, with Epstein's arrest, Manhattan Federal Court.
Right. These were new sex trafficking charges. And people might remember this wasn't his first run-in with the law, but these new allegations were, well, they were substantial.
They really were. And the court considered him a pretty significant flight risk. They noted all his international travel, something like 20 flights in just 18 months before that.
Wow. So bail was denied?
Bail denied, which was a huge decision, really set the stage for everything that came after. He was then put in the Special Housing Unit, the SHU, at the Metropolitan Correctional Center.
SHU.
Yeah.
That's the more secure bit, right? Segregated.
Exactly. It's often used for inmates who need more protection or are maybe a higher security risk. In Epstein's case, it was supposedly for his own safety.
But even in that secure unit, things got, well, disturbing even before his death.
Yeah, that incident on July 23rd, only a couple of weeks after bail was denied.
He was found injured in his cell. Neck injuries.
That's right. The details are still a bit murky, actually. His cellmate at the time, Nicholas Tarcaglione, was facing very serious charges himself. He denied having anything to do with it.
And was he cleared?
Yeah, an internal prison investigation later cleared him. It's interesting, there were even some unnamed sources suggesting Epstein might have sort of staged it, maybe hoping to get transferred.
Huh. But after that incident, he was put on suicide watch.
He was,
Hmm.
which indicates, serious concerns about his mental state at that point.
Okay, but here's where it gets really, really interesting for me.
Right.
He was later taken off suicide watch.
That decision, reportedly made by a high-level psychologist.
And that's become such a major point of contention. People question that constantly, especially given what happened next.
Precisely. The rationale for removing that level of supervision is a key question. To go from being considered, such a risk that you need constant monitoring to then having that watch removed, it raises huge questions.
And then, not long after, August 10th, 2019.
Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell at the MCC. They performed CPR, but he was pronounced dead at New York Downtown Hospital.
And the official cause of death.
The New York City medical examiner, Dr. Barbara Sampson, ruled it as suicide by hanging. But that conclusion was, well, it was far from the end of the story.
No, not at all. It almost immediately sparked widespread doubt. This is where all the controversies really ignite.
Yeah, there were immediate reports about just failures in standard jail procedures that night.
Like what?
Well, for instance, his cellmate had been transferred out the day before, so he was alone.
Okay.
He also somehow had a bed sheet, which was reportedly used in the hanging, even though he'd previously been on suicide watch. Now, maybe inmates under just close observation could have them, but it still raised eyebrows.
And the guards.
The
Yeah.
guards. The 2 guards on duty that night were later indicted. The accusation was that they fell asleep and then falsified records to cover it up, to make it look like they'd done the required checks every 30 minutes.
Wow, so multiple procedural issues right there.
It's this convergence of apparent failures. And then adding another layer of suspicion was the reported malfunction of 2 security cameras right outside his cell.
The cameras weren't working. Seriously.
That was the report. So no footage from those key cameras.
Right. And then you have Epstein himself, who had allegedly told people he had damaging information on, powerful figures.
Which naturally fueled all sorts of speculation. That maybe he didn't kill himself, that maybe he was silenced to stop that information getting out.
And this wasn't just like fringe internet stuff. That Epstein didn't kill himself meme just exploded.
It absolutely took off. It became part of popular culture.
It really did. And it wasn't just a few people thinking it. Public opinion polls back then showed a huge chunk of the population believed he was actually murdered.
Yeah, one poll suggested nearly half thought it was murder, way more than believed the official suicide ruling. It really shows the depth of public distrust.
That meme, as the Wikipedia page details, it just went everywhere.
Sporting events, award shows, T-shirts, mugs.
It was kind of dark humor, but it also felt like this very visible way people were saying, we don't buy the official story.
Exactly. It tapped into that deep-seated skepticism about official narratives,
Yeah.
especially when powerful people and apparent inconsistencies are involved.
And beyond just the events of that night, there were also big concerns raised about how his body was handled after he died.
Yes, the way his body was removed from the cell. Reportedly, that went against Bureau of Prisons protocol. Well, generally, a scene where someone has died, especially a suspected suicide in custody, should be treated like a potential crime scene, preserved carefully.
Right. Makes sense.
And crucially, prison staff apparently failed to photograph Epstein's body as it was found in the cell. That kind of photo would have been incredibly valuable evidence for investigators later.
A massive omission.
It really is. And Epstein's legal team, they moved fast. They challenged the medical examiner's initial conclusions pretty much right away and launched their own independent investigation.
And that independent investigation involved hiring their own expert, right?
That's right. They hired Dr. Michael Baden, a very well-known forensic pathologist, to observe the official autopsy being done by Chief Medical Examiner Barbara Sampson.
And the autopsy itself that revealed details that just added fuel to the fire.
Indeed it did. Reports came out that Epstein had multiple fractures in his neck, specifically the hyoid bone, that small U-shaped bone up high in the neck, and also the thyroid cartilage.
And Dr. Baden had something to say about that.
He did. He stated publicly, based on his, extensive experience, that those kinds of fractures are more typically seen in homicidal strangulation cases.
Not usually in hangings.
He said they were less common in suicidal hangings, especially jail hangings. He claimed he'd reviewed thousands and had never seen that specific combination of fractures in a suicide by hanging.
But Dr. Sampson, the chief medical examiner, she didn't agree.
No, she stood firmly by her ruling. Suicide by hanging. She argued that while, yes, these fractures can happen in homicides, they can also happen in suicides.
Especially in older individuals.
Right. Epstein was 66. She said bone structure can change with age, and emphasized you have to look at all the evidence together, not just one finding.
So conflicting expert opinions right there.
Absolutely. And that 60 Minutes report really highlighted this. They consulted other forensic experts, and there wasn't universal agreement there either.
Some backed Baden.
Some agreed with Baden, finding multiple fractures highly unusual for a suicide hanging. But others suggested, well, it could be consistent with hanging, especially depending on the exact mechanics, the drop, the person's age.
So even within the forensic community, it wasn't clear-cut.
Not at all. A real divergence of opinion on the significance of those neck bones.
Were there other injuries noted in the autopsy report?
Yes, quite a few actually. Contusions, bruises on his wrists, an abrasion on his forearm, deep muscle hemorrhaging like bleeding in his shoulder, an injury on the back of his neck, a cut on his lip.
And a possible injection mark?
And a possible injection mark, yes. Now, some of those, maybe the wrist bruises or shoulder injury, could potentially be explained by resuscitation efforts at the hospital.
Right, CPR and things like that.
Possibly. But their presence just adds another layer of complexity, another set of things that fueled more speculation.
And then there were petechiae, those tiny red spots.
Yes, petechiae, small pinprick-sized spots from burst capillaries. They were noted on his face, mouth, and eyes.
What's the significance of those?
Well, as Dr. Baden pointed out, they can be an indicator of strangulation because of the pressure buildup.
Yeah.
But again, it's not definitive proof of homicide. They can occur in other situations too. So their meaning here is also debated.
And that 60 Minutes piece also mentioned something about the noose itself.
Right, the ligature found in the cell. Photos apparently showed both ends were sort of folded over and hemmed, not cut cleanly.
But didn't a guard report cutting him down with a knife?
That was the report. So that discrepancy, hemmed ends versus being cut down, just adds to this long list of unusual details and unanswered questions.
Okay, so the official ruling is suicide, but there's just this mountain of conflicting interpretations, weird circumstances.
Unusual medical findings, procedural failures,
Yeah.
it all contributes to the persistent doubt.
Now, beyond the immediate aftermath, formal investigations did get started, right?
Oh yes, the FBI got involved, and the Department of Justice Inspector General also launched probes into how this could have happened.
And what did the Inspector General find?
The report came out in June 2023. It ultimately agreed with the suicide ruling. However,
There's a however.
the big however, the report was scathing about the jail officials. It cited major negligence, misconduct, and outright job performance failures that essentially allowed this situation to occur.
So confirming the procedural breakdowns we talked about.
Absolutely. And then there's the separate legal action, the lawsuit from the Jane Does against the government.
This feels like a really critical piece of the ongoing story.
It is. This lawsuit, filed by women identified only as Jane Does 1 through 12, targets the United States government, specifically the FBI.
And what's the core allegation?
They argue the FBI failed to follow its own rules, its own protocols, and basically missed or ignored crucial information. Information about banks being involved and potentially powerful people being part of Epstein's sex trafficking ring.
The complaint mentions J.P. Morgan Chase specifically.
Yes. It alleges that between 2006 and 2008, so years earlier, J.P. Morgan Chase reportedly tried multiple times through different channels to warn the federal government about suspicious money movements involving Epstein.
And raised concerns about child prostitution?
Exactly. Expressed concerns about potential child prostitution related to those transactions. And this information apparently surfaced more clearly in a later legal fight between the U.S. Virgin Islands and J.P. Morgan Chase.
And the lawsuit makes some pretty serious claims about what the FBI might have known and when.
It does. The Jane Does allege Epstein's office was routinely getting passports and visas for trafficking victims, often without proper checks, and that the FBI allegedly didn't investigate these red flags properly.
They even suggest the FBI had evidence way back in 2005.
They claim the FBI had evidence relating to child prostitution and sex trafficking linked to Epstein as early as March 2005, and allegedly failed to act decisively.
And it's important, I think, to remind people why these plaintiffs are using pseudonyms.
Absolutely critical. It's for their own protection. The lawsuit says explicitly they're using Jane Doe because the allegations involve sexual assault, which is incredibly sensitive, and because they fear retaliation.
Retaliation from Epstein's associates.
From the wealthy, powerful people who are allegedly part of his network. They argue that the FBI's failures, their alleged negligence, directly caused them severe harm, including PTSD.
So after Epstein died, the criminal charges against him were dropped, right?
Yes, that's standard procedure when a defendant dies. The charges were dismissed, but the focus definitely shifted.
To his alleged associates.
Exactly. People like Ghislaine Maxwell, who was, a very prominent associate, she was arrested, indicted, and eventually convicted on multiple sex trafficking charges.
And Jean-Luc Brunel.
Another figure linked to Epstein. He was arrested in France, but he also died by suicide while he was awaiting trial there.
And the reaction from public figures right after Epstein's death was pretty intense.
Oh, yeah. Lots of shock, calls for immediate, thorough investigations. Attorney General Barr at the time said publicly he was appalled and ordered investigations.
Politicians weighed in too.
Numerous senators, representatives expressing deep concerns about how the prison system failed. Even President Trump got involved, retweeting a post that hinted at a conspiracy theory.
Was there any accountability within the Bureau of Prisons itself? Personnel changes?
Well, the warden of the MCC, where Epstein died, was reassigned pretty quickly.
Okay.
And those two guards who were on duty at the SHU that night, they were indicted for falsifying records and conspiracy.
Did they go to trial?
They ended up reaching a deferred prosecution agreement, which basically meant the charges could eventually be dropped if they met certain conditions, like community service and cooperating with the Inspector General's investigation.
Right. And what about that surveillance footage issue from the first incident in July?
Yes. That was another huge controversy. Footage from outside his cell during that first apparent suicide attempt in July was initially reported as missing. Then the story changed to it being permanently deleted because of some kind of technical error.
Which just sounds suspicious.
It absolutely fueled more suspicion. That lack of video evidence is another gap in the record.
And we have to circle back to the meme, Epstein didn't kill himself. It really did become more than just an internet joke.
It truly did. It crossed
Damn.
over into mainstream culture, became this widely recognized shorthand.
Like a catchphrase for skepticism.
Exactly. For many, sure, it was dark humor, but it was also this very public, persistent way to keep the questions alive, to signal disbelief in the official story. It even got commercialized, put on T-shirts, all sorts of merchandise.
And it wasn't just online trolls saying it.
No. Figures like Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, even Epstein's own brother, Mark Epstein, have publicly stated they believe he was murdered.
So when we try and piece all this together, we have the official ruling. Suicide by hanging. Clear enough on paper.
But it's just constantly pushed up against this whole range of other factors that suggest, well, maybe the story's more complicated, or at least less straightforward.
Right. The persistent doubts, the conspiracy theories, they're fueled by all those suspicious circumstances surrounding his death in federal custody.
The documented negligence, the misconduct by prison officials that the Inspector General confirmed.
And those conflicting interpretations of the autopsy evidence, especially those neck fractures.
That's precisely it. And that really critical missing piece, the lack of definitive photos showing Epstein's body is found in the cell.
That just leaves this huge shadow of uncertainty, doesn't it? It allows for so many different readings of the situation.
It absolutely does.
Mm.
And even though Epstein himself is dead, the story is clearly not over. You have the ongoing lawsuit from the Jane Does against the government. You have the Justice Department's own investigations and the fallout from the Inspector General's report.
It all indicates this is far from a closed book.
Far from it.
So, for you, our listener, as you think about everything we've just discussed in this deep dive, what questions still stand out most for you about how Jeffrey Epstein actually died?
And maybe thinking more broadly, what does this whole case, with all its unanswered questions, all the persistent doubt, what does it tell us about trust? Trust in our institutions, trust in the official stories they give us.
It definitely leaves you with a lot to think about and maybe encourages some further digging on your own.